Hello, my name is Alex Beer, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here to this webinar, organised in collaboration with the COVID Realities Research Programme, which brings together their project alongside projects from the Young Foundation, Britain Thinks, and Icarus and the University of Huddersfield, which will all ask participants to keep to diaries to chart everyday life in 2020. We are hugely grateful to the participants in those projects, and through them we will explore how family life has been affected by the pandemic, and we'll reflect on what we have learned through and across these 4 projects. I work at the Nuffield Foundation, and for those of you that are not familiar with us, the Nuffield Foundation is an independent charitable trust with a mission to advance educational opportunity and social well-being. We fund research that informs social policy, primarily in education, welfare, and justice. We also provide opportunities for young people to develop skills and confidence in science and research. We're the founder and co-founder of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, and the Ada Lovelace Institute. Early in March, our chief executive, Tim Gardam, issued a challenge about how we might understand the wider social significance of this public health emergency and how we might capture and learn from experiences of the pandemic in real time. These diary projects enable just that, documenting the crisis and providing personal perspectives in the moment on a phenomenon that has affected everybody, but in a multiplicity of different ways. We are delighted to have funded the COVID Realities and the Growing Up Under COVID-19 projects through that call, and are thrilled to also have the opportunity to share with and learn from the participants in the other diary projects that also rose up to meet the moment from the Young Foundation and Britain Thinks. During the webinar, there'll be opportunities to hear key findings from each project. We'll also be hearing directly from some of those who've been keeping the diaries. In discussion, there'll be time to reflect upon those experiences and what they tell us about how society, and how we, and specifically how policymakers, might want to respond. And now the rules of engagement for today. So you webinar participants will not be visible or audible during the webinar. We will have live closed captioning in English today, and to turn it on, please click the CC button along the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will make a recording of the webinar that will be available on our website shortly afterwards. If you've got any questions, and I'm sure that you will do, please do put those in the Q&A at any point during the webinar, and highlight if that question is for a specific speaker. And also, if you'd like to live tweet during the event, we'd like to suggest the hashtag COVID Diaries. And so without further ado, we'll turn to the event itself, and first to one of those diary participants that I mentioned. And this is a reading of 2 diary extracts by Victoria, one of the participants in the COVID Realities project. Victoria is a single parent of 2 young children and a survivor of domestic violence. She's pleased to take part in the project as she wants her experiences and voice to be heard, and she's a regular diary contributor.
23rd of July 2020. I cried like a baby yesterday. On Tuesday, our local community centre sent over some packs with food and activities for the kiddies. This was from the youth group that my kids would normally attend in the holidays, where they'd normally do crafts and have lunch. So in the pack were fresh ingredients for lunch and crafts, and I mean fresh. The lunch was a loaf of soft, fresh white bread, grated cheese packet, a slab of real butter, and a family-sized pack of fresh honey roast ham slices. We felt like kings. Kiddies kept asking for sandwiches since because it tasted so good. It was soft and fresh and luxurious. They also provided a bag of bananas and oranges, which have gone down a lovely treat. We made banana milkshakes in the blender with milk powder and water. The sweetness of the bananas masked the powder nicely. It was a lovely treat and a good mood lifter. This arrived at the same time as the food relief parcels we get weekly, as the 2 teams work closely together. It was easy to tell which food was provided by which organisation. From this usual relief parcel, We were given some biscuits, tinned beans, tinned meatballs, and some add water items, of which we are grateful. But my kiddies are lately refusing to eat, saying that it makes them feel sick. They're sick of tinned goods. They miss me making meaty and healthy foods. My kids don't complain though. They never act spoiled over it. They don't turn their noses up at it when I offer it, and will often join me to see what herbs or spices we have left to try and improve upon the meal options. I'm very worried about our salt intake, especially the kiddies. Surely all these tinned salted goods aren't healthy. 11th of August 2020. Hopelessness bites. I've got no money again until the end of the month. The food parcel we get are making me feel sick. All these high salt tinned goods are giving me headaches and the runs. Kiddies and I have been enjoying the garden, soaking up the sun. We're good at self-entertainment, so I'm not worried. I've been reading, which was nice while it lasted. The books always end too fast. My kiddies have learned to build cities and villages on Minecraft. They only started playing at the start of lockdown. I'm pretty impressed by their skill development. They've been putting on shows for me in the garden. My daughter is becoming quite the comedian, and her grasp of sarcasm is shockingly good for her age. We were planning to take a trip to town next payday, end of the month, but I see in the news a slow but steady rise in cases again, and I don't trust government data anymore. They care only about money and not lives. They've made this obvious many times during this pandemic, so it's easy to assume that the numbers are secretly higher than is published, so I don't feel able to go out. I'd normally have saved up from Easter to take the kids to a theme park by now. In this weather, we'd normally be visiting farms, museums, national parks, and nature reserves, play centres, summer fairs, and our town normally hosts a carnival or a dance festival that is always free fun. Can't do any of that this year. I'm sick of watching the world through my phone or the TV. Hope this virus drama ends soon. Hope too many people don't die. Hope I can cancel. Hope I can continue to give my kiddies fudge. Hope I can continue to keep my kiddies safe and loved.
I think that's really powerful stuff. A huge big thank you to Victoria for that. And now I'd like to introduce Ruth Patrick and Maddie Power from the University of York to talk on their early findings from the COVID-19 Realities Project, of whom Victoria was a participant or active participant.
Unmute. So I'm just right, I'm just going to do this as a slideshow like that, and you can see me now. Okay. Right, so I'm going to get started. You always have technical challenges, even with all our practices. So thanks for having us, and thanks to all the speakers as well. COVID Realities kind of co-organised this webinar. And what we want to do, and it's really hard actually to do it having just heard that, but I'll do my best anyway. But we're just trying to document and share some early findings from our participatory diary work with parents and carers. And the way we want to do that is we're just pulling out 3 kind of case studies, so 3 parents that we're working with, and Victoria, who you just heard from, is one of them, and we very much see her as kind of a co-presenter of the project. And because of her experiences of domestic violence, she couldn't be here today, but she wanted her voice to be part of the discussion, and I think in opening the webinar she's done that very well and very powerfully. So just to talk quickly about our approach and what we've done and why we're doing it. So What we've done, and we're very grateful to the Nuffield Foundation for funding us to do this, is that we've managed to create a kind of online safe space where parents and carers can document and share their experiences of family life on a low income during COVID-19. And importantly, they share that kind of experiences, but then we reshare an anonymized version of those experiences kind of very quickly on our website. And what that then enables is that we're creating like a live archive of family lives lived through the pandemic and through time. Parents can take part by sharing diaries, as Victoria's doing, but they can also respond to our big question of the week, which is a kind of video question that we pose to participants so that they can respond in various ways. Also, and really importantly, they can take part in virtual discussion groups, what we call our big ideas groups. Underpinning all of this is a really strong emphasis on an ethics of care and reciprocity. And in everything that we do in the participatory kind of online space, we're trying to learn lessons from our previous participatory work, but which was face-to-face. So as we go, we're learning and adapting that approach to the online space. And critically, and kind of really core to everything we do, we're trying to make sure that we involve participants in decision making and that they're kind of integral to the kind of progress and the decisions that are made about the project going forward. In terms of kind of participant and engagement, the project kind of launched in terms of the fieldwork in June this year, and it will run right through till the same time next year. And to date, over 120 parents and carers have engaged in some way. And that includes a really diverse cohort. It's predominantly female, as we'd kind of expect, with a kind of diary-based project that includes and focuses on the kind of parent experience, but it also includes people in and out of work, those in receipt of benefits previous to the pandemic, and also those newly experiencing benefit receipt, and also a range of kind of different experiences of both the formal social security system, but also Section 95 support for people that are claiming refugee status. We've got really strong and rising engagement that we're really hoping we can sustain over the life of the project. It's one of the biggest challenges, given that it runs for a year, but we're averaging 70 to 100 posts a week, and overall we've got more than 1,000 posts overall. And this dashboard that you can see on the slide is the kind of dashboard that people see when they log on through the project, and where they can add to their diaries or answer the big questions of the week. So I'm just going to hand over to Maddie, who's just going to talk about the other two participants that we're flagging today.
Fantastic, thanks so much, Ruth. So you've already heard from Victoria B, who's a key participant, and I'm going to really briefly just talk about two other participants and their experiences over this time. The first is Nellie Kay. Nellie is a co-parent to two young children. She lives in the north of England with her partner. And she writes in August about the mental health experiences of her and her partner. She says that they both suffered from anxiety and depression before COVID, but actually it's been made much worse by the additional stresses brought by COVID, particularly financial. She talks about her attempts to get support from clinicians, but actually the tendency just to medicate because of the context and not to provide the talking therapy that she needs. Nellie's experience has been really closely shaped by her oldest child starting school. So her eldest child started school in September. And she writes a lot about the challenges of having the two young children at home during this time and the additional costs of that, and particularly about the additional costs of her child starting school. So the difficulties around buying and accessing uniforms amid social distancing, but also amid low income, both she and her partner on universal credit. But she also talks about the support that they've been given from her child's nursery and how valuable this has been, and how it provides her a break and gives some independence to her daughter. Next slide, please. More recently, so since her child started school, they've had huge challenges and anxieties around bubbles bursting, around self-isolating. So she and her partner are on universal credit, and her partner is trying to start a business, which has been immensely challenging in this period. And the anxieties that have been brought by bubbles bursting and the additional financial cost of that have been very challenging. And they found they've had to isolate twice, but within this period, they've not really got any help. And actually they're having children at home and they lose work that would otherwise be planned. And this creates a wider kind of situation in which they're constantly uncertain about what's going to happen next and how to manage these new difficulties. Thanks, Ruth. The second person that I want to briefly talk about is Meg. So Meg's been involved from the project since the very beginning, and she was involved with the kind of development of the dashboard that Ruth showed you. Meg is a lone parent to 3 children, and 2 of them are adults. She has a chronic health condition and she's on employment support allowance. And her health condition has really shaped her experience of COVID realities in a way and of the pandemic. In the early stages, she was living with her youngest son and her middle son. And her middle son was working in a pub kitchen. And there were immense challenges of having a kind of multi-generational household when she herself experienced chronic health conditions. So the anxieties around her son bringing home COVID when she was trying to social distance and self-isolate, and the stresses that brought to the relationship. Like Victoria talked about earlier, she didn't really have any confidence in the government's handling of the pandemic, which kind of brought even more stresses that actually the pub kitchen in which her son worked might not be COVID secure. But she also talks about the joys of spending time with her children, particularly her youngest son, of going out with them, of taking the dog for a walk, and of the opportunities for her son to have physical activity and be outside that she really relishes. Thanks, Ruth. So Meg's experience of COVID-19 has been closely shaped by her own chronic health condition. So as well as having to self-isolate and shield, she's also been booked in to have major surgery during this time, but that's been delayed multiple times. And each time she has to self-isolate. And so she's trying to self-isolate in the context of trying to do online shopping and care for her son, all while living on a very low income. And she finds often that she doesn't qualify as vulnerable enough to get the shopping delivery slots. And so she's constantly navigating. She's writing here about sitting at her laptop at 6:30 a.m. waiting for slots to come up, all while trying to navigate moving health appointments and moving surgery and self-isolating with her son. But I mean, Meg writes, I'll just say last thing, with great humour, and she's an activist in this space. And I think she's been a fantastic contributor all along and really making it a lively project.
Thank you, Maddie. So really briefly, super briefly, just to share, we wanted just to share some methodological learnings first, and then just some kind of more substantive kind of reflections. So I think, and hopefully it's kind of been demonstrated by the evidence we've been able to show, we've really been taken aback, I suppose, by the richness of the diary methodology and how helpful it's been to us in terms of providing that rich evidence base of people's experiences through time, and just the generosity of participants, I suppose, as well, in giving of their time to share their experiences, but also the flexibility of the methodology. So some participants write daily, sometimes more than once a day, and others just kind of touch base once a month, sometimes even less. So it's giving people flexible ways to engage in the project, which is really important. And that value, of course, of the temporal lens. So the idea, if all goes to plan, and we should never rest too much on that, but if it goes to plan, we will have a years of people's experiences over time. So getting that temporal lens has been really important. Just incredibly time intensive though, with the participatory focus. So I can't emphasize enough how resource intensive it has been to do the kind of participatory engagement and the involvement work, but also rewarding. And I think the final methodological point we want to make is that actually when we think about impact and we kind of conceptualize research impact, broadening it out to think about the impact of everyone involved in the project, and actually sometimes the really beneficial outcomes for participants who are engaged and involved in these kind of projects. And here on the slide there's a quote from Victoria again, just talking about the value she saw of both sharing her experiences, but also seeing some of her experiences reflected back on the website through that live archive, and realizing that she wasn't alone. And Victoria's also taken part and enjoyed the virtual discussion groups. Okay, I've got a minute. I think I've got a minute. Alex might say I've got even less than that, but yeah, I think I've got a minute for early reflections. So this is really kind of ongoing work where we're in the depths of the field work, but some kind of key reflections I wanted to share. Just the fact everyone here at the webinar knows about the challenges, the pressures of navigating COVID-19. Those pressures are just amplified and extended and made more difficult by the financial pressures of living on a low income, which also makes it very difficult. The strategies that people commonly use to get by and manage over low income have been interrupted and made impossible by the pandemic. And this has negative impacts on people's mental health and often their physical health as well. We saw and we heard from Victoria about some of the shortcomings, although they're very welcome with charitable provision. We haven't been able to touch on it in much detail, but of course, real shortcomings and limitations with the social security response as well. Family, kind of been both a source of really important support and joy, actually, which we saw in Victoria, we saw in Meg, and we saw in Nellie Kay, but also some of the usual ways in which families are supporting each other in informal ways, both financially and kind, again being interrupted by the conditions of the pandemic. Just to conclude, I think that the participants themselves and we as a sort of project team feel that families on a low income with dependent children still remain largely absent from policy discussions in the overarching narrative, and we really feel, and the evidence we've got from this project is so important that changes and more attention is paid to their needs. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Ruth and Maddie, and also to all the participants in the COVID Reality Project. Thanks as well for the sort of great care you're taking of your participants and sharing their stories more widely. I'd now like to turn to Michaela Rode from Britain Thinks to talk about your Coronavirus Diaries project.
Yes, thanks, Alex. I'll just get it up. Ooh, skipping ahead. Okay. Right. Well, it's great to be here. So thank you for having us today. So yeah, we're going to talk about some of the big themes that we've heard coming through and how families have experienced this. So this is drawing on our Coronavirus Diaries programme of work, which started in early April and has been made up of a panel of 50 people from around the UK who we've been following on a kind of asking them to complete structured diary tasks on a regular basis. It's a very varied sample of 50 people, so we recruited to ensure that we had a range of life stages in there, so families with young children, families with older school-age children, but also young people and older people, and also looking to get a range of working situations, so right from kind of SME business owners at the one end to the self-employed, gig economy workers, office workers, and frontline workers who've continued to go in to work during the pandemic. In total, we had kind of approximately 20 families with children under 18 in our sample, and that would kind of fluctuate a bit over time, but that's kind of more or less where it ended out, with a kind of range of income levels within that. So quite a varied mix there. We've been publishing regular reports from this work, looking at mood, views on the pandemic, government approval, and kind of changing various perspectives on how behaviours and attitudes are changing. So those reports are all on our website, and in fact the latest version was published this week if anyone is curious. But what we wanted to do today was focus specifically on families and sort of draw out what we've observed from our work in terms of the big themes that that we've seen in how families have responded to this. So there's 7 kind of key insights that I'll talk to, starting with one that is a positive, which is always nice in the context of COVID. With just reflecting on kind of the positives that families have experienced at this time, and how in fact they really are one of the few groups in society that have come out of this with a clear sense of having had something positive come out of it. So just reflecting a bit on that, and then looking at the parent perspective, sort of the mindset the parents have had and how that's impacted the way that they've treated their children and how kind of lenient or otherwise they've been, the challenges that parents have faced, and the kind of emotional stress of trying to kind of be everything to your children, and how they've dealt with that. We'll touch just briefly on family finances and the kind of quite unpredictable impact that's had. We're also going to look at the children's perspective and see it from their point of view, and then just kind of finish up with where things are today as kids have returned to school. So yes, starting with the positive, which I think was certainly coming through a bit in the last presentation. This is a drawing from the child of one of our diaries when we asked them what were some of the things they enjoyed about lockdown, and you can see here it's family front and centre, yeah, there is just this very strong sense of being given a kind of unique opportunity to spend time together as a family. And from the parents, we've heard how much they valued that, feeling like they've really gotten to know their children in a way that they didn't before, and know all their little quirks and personalities. And certainly in the polling, this comes through with people with children under 18 tending to be one of the groups that reports more positive experiences of lockdown. So a real positive there. Coming on to the mindset of parents at this time, what we observed is just a really clear priority on the part of parents to ensure that children don't view this as a stressful or scary time. And that kind of played out in a few different ways. So during the first lockdown, we saw quite a lot, or we heard quite a lot from parents of them being a bit wary of putting too much pressure on their children to kind of do their schoolwork or stick to a really rigid routine, just feeling like they needed to give them space and let them do what they wanted to do a bit more than they might usually do. And in some cases we heard parents just say, I'm not even going to make them do any schoolwork, like that's just not the priority right now. Also sort of looking for ways to make the time a bit more enjoyable for children and make it all a bit easier. That often means like little treats, so kind of going to bed late, sleeping in, snacks, screen time, all things that parents might normally be strict on were kind of given out a bit more easily. And also we heard a lot from parents about trying to minimise news consumption for their children, as they really noticed that having a negative impact on them. By far the greatest challenge that we heard about was just the sheer effort of keeping children entertained. And certainly at the start of lockdown, there was a real energy around this from parents. You can see the quote here, you know, we're having 2-hour planning meetings every night to plan out the next day. And, you know, parents would tell us about activity boards that they'd drawn up and all sorts of kind of fun, creative activities they were doing with their kids. Across the board, that seemed to fall away as the weeks and months went on, and just became more and more difficult to keep up that motivation and that energy, and children sort of getting more and more bored of those activities. So a very common pattern of kids kind of gradually being left a bit more to their own devices over time, and those treats becoming a more and more a bigger feature of how they were kept entertained. And this has been a really emotional experience for parents, well, for everyone, but for parents in particular, just that feeling, that pressure to be everything to their children, to be their friend and their teacher as well as their parent, and really struggling sometimes with feelings of guilt at not always being able to live up to that, and that being quite compounded by the whole narrative around the super parent, which yeah, social media certainly doesn't help with. And on top of that, we also heard parents saying this is quite a lonely time, that normally would share the burden of parenting with friends, with family, and that wasn't possible during COVID, and that was particularly true for single parents who really found it difficult to you know, sometimes going weeks without speaking to another adult. Family finances just had really varied and unpredictable impacts. So kind of on the one hand, you have families who were previously in a strong financial position who really had the rug pulled out from under them, you know, for a variety of reasons. A common reason was just that bad luck of falling through the cracks of income support and finding themselves in really very difficult circumstances. But on the other hand, you had families who were struggling to get by before, were never kind of able to save, who were suddenly finding, you know, because they were continuing to be in work, that they have more money in the bank, that they're able to save in a way that they never have before, and that's kind of opened up whole new opportunities for them potentially, sort of maybe being able to save for a mortgage and all sorts. So a really complicated and varied picture there. From the children's point of view, so these are some photos and a poem that were sent in by the children of our diarists when we asked them what they missed during lockdown. And you can see here how strongly social contact is coming through as the main thing that children are missing. So, you know, I miss the vibe of school and the noise. A little chat with my friends in class makes the day go by quicker. My friends used to come up and invite me for a game of badminton or swimming or even out on my bike, and now I can't do that. And just really acutely feeling that lack of social contact. And we found that was actually, from what we could pick up, maybe even more so for younger children than older children, just younger children having maybe less opportunity or less agency to reach out to their friends of their own accord, and so kind of gradually finding themselves more isolated. And it was a very big concern for parents, really noticing the impact this was having on their children. So we heard about kind of difficult behaviour, particularly amongst younger children, a kind of tendency to maybe become more isolated, spend more time on screens, and just noticing that deterioration over time. And parents are really worried about, you know, what is this going to mean long term? Does this have an impact on their social development skills and their kind of well-being in the long term? Thankfully, the return to school certainly does seem to have helped. Parents say they've noticed, you know, a really positive turnaround in kind of mood and well-being with their children's return to school. Just that sense of returning to routine, having a bit more of a normal family life back, and their children kind of immediately springing back into that. So that's been a real positive, kind of notwithstanding the challenges of bubbles bursting, which is definitely a real stress point. What we found is
Michaela, can I ask you just to wrap up in the next minute, please?
Yes, absolutely. What we found is that parents are now looking slightly beyond the kind of immediate impact of the crisis and looking to the long term, and are particularly worried about ramifications this might have on the long-term life chances of their children. And that's it. So yeah, thank you again for having us, and look forward to hearing the questions.
Thank you ever so much, Michaela, for sharing those diverse perspectives and those sort of different experiences over time as well. And sorry for the interruption, but participants in this webinar, we've got so much material we want to share with you. We've got quite a strict timetable we need to stick to. We do have a moment now in the timetable just to reflect on some of the questions that have emerged so far. We've got about 5 or 6 minutes for the questions, and then we're going to move on to presentations from the Young Foundation, well, presentation from Sarah and Eve, basically. All right, so here we've got some questions here. If you've got any others for these two groups, there will be an opportunity to ask them later, but also an opportunity now. And we've got the first question for Ruth and Maddie, which particularly was, you described the sample as diverse, and can you tell us a little bit more about that, and if the diversity posed any particular challenges?
Shall I go, Maddie, and then you jump in? Yeah, so I mean, basically, we've set out and we've tried really hard to kind of get a diverse sample. But also one of the things about the methodology is that we're not kind of, we've got like a screening question where we ask, you know, are you on a low income, are you a parent and carer? But then that's all people have to do to sign up to the project. So we then ask people to add additional demographic details as and when they want to. So the idea is that we don't want that to be a barrier to people taking part. So I should have said that we don't have like full demographic details for all of our participants, but of those we do, the split is that we realize that actually almost exactly replicates the general population, in that we have like 89% white and then 11% from minority and ethnic communities. We also have some asylum seekers, and we do have some for whom English is a second language. I think what works well for us and what we're fortunate about is that people can do the diary entries in different formats. So they can do video diaries, which I think is, and they can listen to the video, you know, rather than just responding to the text. So I think that's helpful for people that maybe struggle or for whom English isn't their first language. But I think we haven't, you know, we don't have the resources, you know, we didn't ask, you know, we don't have the resources to kind of translate materials into multiple languages, and that's just, we've had to accept that that's I guess a limitation of the project. And just the other thing I wanted to say is that we're also mindful of it in the virtual discussion groups, because they have a diverse range of participation as well, and some there for whom people English is second language. And one way we've worked on that is that our research fellow Jeff Page has set up a really nice system where he invites participants to buddy up with somebody. So where there's somebody that's maybe, and it could be because of language barriers, but also because they've been shy. These Zooms we're all learning, aren't we, as we go, how to interact on Zooms. And so he provides that support to people, or the offer of support where actually a participant gives peer support to another participant.
Michaela, can I direct that question to you also, and throw in an additional question for you whilst we're at it, which is whether there have been any differences in your findings across the 4 nations? And firstly, thanks to Asma for the first question, who's also pointed out that the ethnic minority population in Britain is 20%. So thank you, Asma, for your question and that clarification. And then thank you to Iona for the question about whether there have been any differences in the findings across 4 nations.
Great, yes, happy to pick those up. So we did purposefully recruit. We had a bit of fluctuation over time. So yeah, the sample varied a bit month to month, but each month we had minimum 6 BAME, and then we would always kind of end up with a bit more than that, just depending on kind of how we were meeting other quotas. So yeah, hopefully that answers that question. In terms of differences in findings, I'd say we saw big differences regionally, very much related to the restrictions and differences in restrictions across the country. The biggest differences by region tend to be political, in terms of how people are judging the national governments. When it comes to families, I would say the biggest differences we saw on a geographical basis were much more about what their community was like, whether they have a garden, which is just hugely important, and just yeah, the kind of rural, suburban, urban dynamic becoming incredibly important, more so than any like other geographical factor.
Thank you very much, Michaela. Right, and so we've also got some questions about the data generation phase, and about whether there are any ways to make the participatory approach sort of less intensive for researchers. So Ruth or Maddie might ask you to respond to making on the resource intensiveness of the participatory methodology. And I might save the question on the data generation phase until later on towards the end, when we can ask all of the participants, all of the presenters to reflect on that.
Maddie, do you want to go, or do you?
Yeah, I think just on it being resource intensive, I think we've struggled with it being resource intensive and thought of ways around it, but actually I think it just is really, and a massive element for us is relationship building. with participants in various different forms, and that's been hugely important to kind of having a project which is participatory, to one that people can be involved in different ways and feel supported. But that does take a huge amount of time. Actually, Jeff's in some ways his main role is that kind of relationship building and engaging with participants. And I'm not sure there's really a way around it beyond just accepting that it's very resource intensive, and you need to put time into it to do a good job. Ruth, would you add anything?
Yeah, no, just entirely to echo that. And I think that ultimately the kind of duty of care that you have to the participants kind of trumps everything else, doesn't it? So actually, I think not the only, actually we made loads, and I just made a mistake in the earlier response. So I was going to say, one of the mistakes that we made probably is just when we designed the project, not allowing ourselves, or not, properly thinking through, this is going to take this much time, so we need to allow that much in our kind of staffing capacity. So I think it's more, but I also think, and hopefully projects like these are showing the value of taking that participatory approach, because I think it is incredibly valuable, and it does allow us to draw on that expertise that people with the direct experience have. But it is just I think exactly as Maddie says, it just is resource intensive.
Right. Thank you very much, Lynn, for your question. And now we're going to move on to the second set of presentations, and they're going to be sort of started off by Tapua, who's one of the participants in the Growing Up Under COVID-19 study, talking about how she collated and contributed her diary entries.
Hi, I'm Isra and I'm part of Leanne's research panel. I'm just going to be talking about how I use diaries to document my family life. So during lockdown, I started this research diary where I would document what I do every single day, my mood, my productivity, any questions I'd have, I'd highlight. Then I'd take a photo of it and post it on Yammer, hoping that other people would engage with it. But because it's a diary and I presented it as a diary, like my own personal diary, people were less likely to engage with it because it seems like it's almost personal, and that you shouldn't be looking at the diary, even though that's what I want people to be doing. So I switched from using this to using Yammer, and that was actually more effective because it forced me to be less waffly in a way, get straight to the point, ask questions that I wanted to get across really quickly. For example, nobody's going to want to read pages and pages about my life. I'm sure they have other interesting things to do. So on Yammer, I would say I had an interesting conversation with my dad about finances and how COVID's impacting his work. I would put something on Yammer, ask a question at the end, and then get responses from my panel. That was much more effective. Or even if I saw something on social media, for example on Twitter, that was really interesting about COVID, or any newspaper articles that I'd read, I'd put my thoughts and feelings about that on Yammer and people would comment about that. In terms of family, like talking about family and stuff like that, and documenting how my siblings are also experiencing COVID, using Yammer has been very, very effective. Because not only do I input what my siblings and I are going through, I'm also getting responses from other people about how their family are going through it as well. So it kind of helps steer my research in the right direction. I hope that's been helpful.
With a huge big thanks to Isra for that contribution, and huge big apologies for getting her name wrong at the start. There'll be another video from Tapua later, and I got the order mixed up. So huge big apologies. Thanks very much to Isra. And now are we going to have Tapua's video next, or are we going to hear Sarah's presentation? Okay, we're going to Tapua's presentation, Tapua's video entry next.
It's Tapua, and I'm going to tell you about how I've been collecting my research during the pandemic. So every week I put together a little file in my Google Photos where I have 3 pieces of evidence. from Monday to Saturday. So this can be pictures, videos, or screenshots. Then at the end of the week, in my notes page, I write like a short little paragraph about how my week's gone, how social distancing and wearing masks and all the sort of guidelines are in school, any sort of things that happen in the news, anything else that's kind of affected me, and just anything else I think is like relevant and that's going on at the time. Then at the end of the month, I create this little audio file, which is about 10 minutes long, kind of going through everything that's happened throughout the 4 weeks of that month. And I kind of explain sort of in depth the news, the guidelines, whether they're being stuck to, whether they're not being stuck to, sort of how my friends are feeling and how I'm feeling, and how sort of generally people in sixth form are feeling, and also a bit of inclusion on my sort of family and other friends in the wider community apart from my school, and anyone that I kind of know about my area and a bit further out as well, and how they're finding the pandemic and school and work and any other sort of places that they are. And I kind of summarize all of that in that 10-minute video, and I do that every single month. And it just kind of like explains everything that's really going on and how everything's feeling, and sort of my hopes and thoughts for maybe the month ahead. Hello, my name is Tapua, and I'm going to...
I mean, that was just, those were just absolutely great to hear, the awareness that those young people have about you know, the world around them and the usefulness of, you know, what they are thinking and experiencing right now. They were just great to hear. And now I'd like to hand over to Sarah Rizzo from Ecoris, who's been working with on this project with the University of Huddersfield. And they've been looking on young people's experiences of growing up under COVID-19. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. I'm sharing my screen. 1 second. Okay. Yeah, so the Growing Up Under COVID-19 project is funded by the Nuffield Foundation, and it will be running from April 2020 to September 2021, all conducted online. So we are delivering the project within with the Ecoris and the University of Huddersfield, and we selected 70 young people from Lebanon, Italy, Singapore, and the 4 home nations in the UK, from age between 14 and 18, and they come from very different backgrounds, including like Black and ethnic minority groups, and people that experience the care system or like different socioeconomic conditions. The idea is to have young people as co-researchers. So at the beginning of the project, we have trained them in participatory action research, trying to explain them how free they can be in selecting the research topic that they want to focus on. Of course, it will be related to the impact of COVID on their lives, but it can be ranging from education to mental health to their family life, social relationships. So it's been really broad. And it can also evolve throughout the research. And we have also presented a few data collection methods that they might use, which include interviews, document review, surveys, including like research diaries, as I will say later. And now throughout the project, we are supporting them individually. So because they are each conducting a research project that is just belong to them, but we are also conducting bi-weekly discussions with 10 panels of, like 7 panels of 10 young people each supported by an adult researcher that is either from the UK or come from Singapore and Italy, in my case. And young people have also participated in the analysis, reporting, co-production of recommendations and dissemination. So as I was saying, research diaries are one of the data collection methods that we have presented and suggested to young people, because first, we think it's a great way to just document their own experiences, thoughts, feelings, and we suggest them to look at their diaries on a weekly basis, at least like an hour per week dedicated to the project, but also because young people have manifested the need to learn from this experience. So to look back at this experience in like months or like a few years' time and see how they've changed, what they've learned throughout the process, and if they've learned anything. Like they manifested the need to actually be sure that they will learn. And so we just suggested diaries as a way to do that. Not all of them have selected diaries as a method, but a few of them have. And even if we provided them with a template for those that wanted a bit more structured, but many of them have actually gone really free, as you saw from the videos, in terms of selecting written, audio, or visual forms of keeping a diary. And there they can just present their personal experience, they can react to the news, they can react to the interviews that they are conducting as part of the research project or the discussions with the other participants. So in a way, the diary is complementing other research methods that they are using in their own research and the discussions with the wider group. So as Isra was saying, Yammer is the online platform that we are using to collaborate and communicate with young people across the 7 panels. And many young people have selected Yammer as a form of a shared diary. So they turned a traditional diary into a collective experience. So they can post about their experience at school with their families, something that struck them of like the news, and they can ask the other participants for comments and use these posts as a way to further develop their research. So there is this constant interaction and constant co-development of the research. Here, this is a piece from one of the participants who have decided to use a diary mixing words and illustrations. And it's interesting because she's providing a meta-analysis of her use of a diary, because she thinks that both words and illustration present advantages and disadvantages. So words can enable to give more details about a certain experience, but they can be too emotionally charged, while illustration allow to present the same message in an indirect way, and they are more open to interpretation. So she wanted to use both languages in her diary. And as I said, our project presents findings across a number of dimensions that have been affected by COVID-19. It can be education, health, social relationships, but family life has been a big theme. And in particular, here I'm presenting findings that came from diaries of young people. So of course, the time spent with family members has changed in a positive and in a negative way. So in a positive, because young people reported that they are less busy now. They are having more time to spend at home. And so as the previous presenters have said, they are discovering their family, they are discovering how enjoyable it can be to do activities together. But at the same time, of course, the social distancing restrictions, the vulnerability of a few family members have forced them to spend time apart. And they are all struggling from that and writing about that in their diaries. And here is again the previous participant and one of her illustrations. And it's interesting because here she used bright colors to transmit the positive mood at the time, because when mask wearing became mandatory, it was when actually numbers were decreasing, people were restarting to go out. And so here she's presenting how her and their family members try to find ways to adapt to the new normal in a positive way. So her mom started to do homemade masks or find fashionable options of this really distinctive COVID element. And again, like finding coping mechanism has been a really important theme, both using diaries as a coping mechanism, as a way to reflect on the situation, but also finding ways to stay positive together as a family. So many young people got a puppy or a cat during this time, not only as a way to make home life nicer, but also as an incentive from their parents for kids to spend more time outside instead of in front of a screen. And also like finding habits, nice habits like eating outside, their meals. And a few young people wrote that they would like to keep this habit even after COVID, because they've now discovered how much they can enjoy family life. And now something really important has been how difficult for young people has been to keep motivation and concentration now that they don't have access to school as they had before. And so how important it has been, and again, resonating with previous presenters, that parents help them to set up a new routine. a really structured routine with a number of different activities to keep the motivation up. And this has been stressful for some, positive for others, but it's important to say that it's not easy for parents probably to keep this routine going. And another finding is that more time spent together meant learning more about each other, learning more, for example, about each other political opinions, which young people can agree or disagree with, but also learning how, for example, the mom of this young person, she learned to appreciate her more because she understood how much she was doing for the family, even during this time, or learning about each other interests. Like this young person was learning about his brother's passion for history or about the news, but also like how difficult it has been for example, LGBTQ young people to talk about that with their family members, because many times their family members don't recognize or don't value their identity, and school is a safe place for these young people. So once again, the diary has become the way to find this privacy back again, but also express their sadness with this situation. And also for those, of course, those children who live in situations with like many siblings or like small houses. And finally, once again, our artistic young participant expressing the new challenges that they have been facing, parents and young people, because, for example, many parents lost their job, and young people wrote about that in their diaries, or they wrote about their friends' parents because who were unable to pay for tuitions. So important at a time when school structure is not as good as it was, and young people need to catch up, but also the queue at food banks at school, as well as the young people seeing their parents struggling with a bigger amount of work, especially those parents working in hospitals, where they were struggling with patients of COVID-19 and their willingness to help, but also like how the diary helped to express this greater sensitivity, because more time spent together looking at their parents and how they were struggling with that. And that's it. I think is all for this. I hope I managed to keep the time.
Thank you. Thank you ever so much, Sarah. That was just a great presentation. All those participants in the Growing Up Under COVID-19 study. It's just great to see the perspectives of the pandemic through those young people's eyes. And I would now like to introduce Eve Avdulas from the Young Foundation, and Eve's going to be talking about how intergenerational relationships and responsibilities have changed as a result of COVID-19.
Great, thank you so much, Alex. I'm just going to share my screen here. Go. Hopefully you guys are able to see that presentation. Wonderful. So yeah, my name is Eve, and I'll be presenting today about our community life and COVID-19 project that's generously funded by the Wellcome Trust. And I also have to acknowledge the rest of my team members who are a part of this project. So I'm presenting on behalf of a large group of us. So for those of you who may not be as familiar with the Young Foundation, we are a UKRI accredited research institution, a community practitioner, and a social investor whose aim is to develop more sustainable and stronger communities across the UK. We were born out of the work of Michael Young, who's a sociologist working in the East End in London, where in typical normal times we would be. And through the years, we've established numerous organizations such as the Open University, Grandparents Plus, Language Line, and most recently in 2019, we relaunched the Institute for Community Studies. So a lot of good work coming from this long legacy, and one of the projects that I will be talking to you guys today about is our COVID-19 and Community Life project. So this project has three main aims and objectives. The first is how has the pandemic affected interactions between individuals and society, and what is the effect on community life, health, well-being, and resilience. The second aim is to understand the role of the digital realm in the community response, And the third is to understand how individuals and communities relate to science and research. So it's quite a large project with these three overarching aims. And the way that we're doing this is through three different methods. The first is an online digital ethnography. So similar to the projects that you've already heard about, we have 150 participants who are participating in our digital diaries on our online platform. They have been participating in weekly activities since September, and the project has actually just wrapped up. We're very excited. Well, I should say this part of the project has just wrapped up, where we've put up our last set of activities last week. Our participants come from a very broad mix of demographic, socioeconomic, and attitudinal views, and we have people from all 4 nations in the UK. There's also the offline telephone interview component, where we are using a peer researcher approach, where we have members of those communities who are interviewing those other individuals in their areas. And there we're working with 30 offline participants. And finally, we are conducting a NatRep telephone survey for a national representative sample of 1,000 UK adults that has just started. So that's gonna happen for the rest of the year. So we have kind of 3 distinct components. Our online activities with these digital diary keepers, we have them complete different tasks. Sometimes they're just open text, sometimes they're more structured as far as polls, Likert scales. We also have creative tasks where we ask them to respond and draw something. They can participate in one-to-one video discussions or virtual park benches, and they also complete a weekly relationships diary. Now, we are exploring a lot of different themes in this research. As I mentioned, it's quite big, but today I'm just going to focus on that kind of top right block, the personal relationships and how they've changed as a result of COVID. So we have asked people over the weeks to talk about their intergenerational relationships. So how are people interacting with and kind of meeting, socializing with people from different generations, and how has that changed as a result of COVID? So this is one of the main questions that we've asked in this kind of part of our research. And prior to COVID taking place, the Nuffield Foundation undertook a project called an intergenerational audit for the UK, and they've generated a lot of different insights. So I should say, sorry, Resolution Foundation, funded by Nuffield Foundation. And we were able to learn a lot from that. Pessimists outnumber optimists 2 to 1, based on whether or not young people will have a better life to the previous generation before COVID. And society, however, we tend to generalize, judge ourselves by how we treat older generations, even though we're much more culturally happy to, just stay to our own bubbles. And also thinking about culture, intergenerational living is far more prevalent in BAME communities. So kind of working off of the basis of what we know, we were interested in saying, what else can we learn about how those things have been affected as a result of the pandemic? So what have we been learning? Well, generally, we've been learning that different generations have been experiencing the pandemic in different ways. I think that's a given. But across generations, we're seeing a shared sense of feelings of loneliness and sense of worry, blame of different generations for the spread of COVID-19, adapting to changing relationships in multi-generational families, greater sense of responsibility, and the development of empathy. And one of the ways that we can kind of understand why these things have changed, not just as a result of COVID, but what's been happening, is through this idea of social capital. So we've been hearing a lot about this notion of social capital and these networks that people are forming. So social capital can be understood as networks or shared interests and experiences that can bond between similar demographics or bridge between different generations. And it's important then that it helps us create strong ties, shared feelings, and increased level of social cohesion and connection and resilience. So from our participants, we've been hearing a lot of examples of bonding capital that brings people together, as well as bridging capital that's created across generations, as well as relationships which unfortunately do not have that social capital. So we've been understanding kind of how this idea is playing a role in these changing relationships. So I want to show you guys what they have to say. As I mentioned, we've been seeing a rise in loneliness and worry. This has happened across generations. So we have somebody who's younger saying, you know, will this be the last time that we get to celebrate with my family? You know, I have older grandparents, older relatives. And then we have somebody who's between 55 and 64 saying, you know, my daughter has no idea of how difficult I'm finding the lack of contact. So the rise in loneliness and worries transcends generations. We're also seeing this idea of blame, blaming other generations for the spread of COVID. The media has been portraying, you know, oh, the young people are to blame, but equally we have people who feel as though the older generation are the worst conforming to restrictions. So a lot of different views in terms of blame and how age has a role to play in that. Multi-generational families and changing relationships have also been impacted by COVID, as the other participants have also pointed out. We have somebody saying, you know, my older daughter, who is very aware about COVID, has been trying to keep us safe, and she advised that we can no longer see each other. Where we have a younger individual who says that, you know, she feels an inner conflict with herself when she wants to be doing more for her grandparents, but she can't. So you have these multi-generational families, which whose kind of interactions have been changed as a result of COVID. We also see a greater sense of responsibility happening between generations. So in some aspects, we have the younger generation saying that we want to support older people. And we also have older people saying we have a desire, you know, and a responsibility to protect everybody. So again, a common theme that transcends generations here. And finally, developing empathy. So this was interesting in terms of this individual who says, I think the pandemic has made me feel much sorry for the generation below me. And she's only, you know, in the millennial generation. So it's quite interesting. And then also an older individual saying that recognized that there's, you know, caring people that want to protect us. So we're seeing these common themes that are being experienced by all age groups. And I think that also resonates a lot with what the other participants have said in the presentation so far, especially with young people too. So how does the lens of social capital help us understand intergenerational relationships? So I have to put a caveat and a disclaimer on this, that we're still ongoing with our analysis and our research. But based on people's experiences so far, we are learning that having a strong sense of social capital has helped to bridge intergenerational relationships during COVID-19. And we're seeing this in the notion of reciprocity and support and shared experience, that when you have those things, it transcends your age and those boundaries that could potentially be created by generations. However, at the same time, while there has been intergenerational support, has often been bonded between groups of similar culture, proximity, and income. People tend to stick to their own families, cultures, and social circles. So there's a question of whether or not we're seeing bridging capital between different groups and how prominent this is. But as I noted, we're still in our analysis, so we still have a ways to go. Oh, I'm just going to, sorry, one quick finish up. Here we go. If you want to keep up to date with us, as I said, our analysis is ongoing. So February 2021, we'll have our results published. You can also subscribe to our newsletter where we publish the snapshot reports for this work. And you can also follow us on Twitter, where we also will present our updates and reporting on this. So thank you.
Thank you, Eve. And again, thanks to all of the participants in your projects that provided those diary entries and other inputs. We're now going to have a brief moment for additional questions, and then we will turn to Kathy Evans, who we're delighted to have. Kathy Evans is Chief Executive of Children England, and she's got both the exciting and unenviable task of reflecting on the rich material that's been shared today. But first, we'll have 5 minutes of questions, then we'll turn to Kathy. The timing's going to be tight, might be just less than 5 minutes. Turning to the questions now. So I'm just struggling to switch between my screens. There we go. And so we've got quite a few questions actually about the data generation phase and how it was done. And I know each of you have sort of put bits in your presentations about, each of the presenters have put bits in their presentations about how they've collected the information. But it'd be great if you could just talk, Sarah, if you could just talk a little bit more about Yammer and how that has been a way of collecting data from your young people, and then just a sort of brief insights from each of you on anything you didn't talk about in your presentations about how you went about collecting the data.
Yeah, sure. So Yammer is a social networking platform that is GDPR safe, which is the reason why we chose that as a way to collaborate with the different groups of young people. So we have an overarching group on Yammer that connect with all the young people across countries, and then a specific group for each of the 7 groups. And so within that, we use the platform to communicate any, so for example, the next meeting with young people, we post that on Yammer, but then the meeting will be held on Microsoft Teams mostly. And so we have group discussions that we record and during which the experience get co-developed, so we can then use that as data. But also we use Yammer exactly for young people to post their surveys, and so they can get a reaction, like response from other young people. They can post the research that get commented by the others. So everything that is posted on Yammer is then turned into data for our research. We hold individual interviews, so one-to-one with each young people. In this way, answering to another question, we can also get more confidential information that they don't feel comfortable in sharing with the entire group. So we use individual interviews for that. And then we just ask, again, individually, if they have like an article that they have produced, a video, an illustration that then can get published on our website. And I included the link to the website. So we are collecting data in many different ways, and both confidentially, like individually, and as a group, and now mostly through discussions. But there are, yeah, we are tailoring even the data collection to the specific groups and their needs of different young people.
So can I then ask Ruth and Maddie to quickly reflect, then Eve, then Michaela?
So on the data generation, I think that, you know, it's been creating that online space. So we probably spent, it was like a really a really hard few months just working collaboratively, as Maddie said, with both participants themselves who we'd kind of already engaged with, and also with a web developer to develop a kind of online space that could be safe and could work for participants, but then also thinking about how we engage with people through other mechanisms. So through, for example, discussion groups and through Zoom. So yeah, I think there's also about it being iterative. So what we've recently done is we've got feedback from all our participants about what they like and don't like about the online space, and then we've kind of released a kind of second version of the dashboard, the online space that responds to some of that feedback. So it's about being constantly, you know, open to change and flexible. I don't know if Maddie wants to add anything to that.
Just to add that when people kind of submit sort of a diary, a written diary, or an image or audio, they can either say it's for the researchers only or public. So they have a choice. If they don't want it to be shared, then it doesn't be shared, and then it's just something that will kind of be taken into kind of when we do thematic analysis of the work.
Eve?
Yep, so we use an online digital platform called Recollective, and it's a kind of a research data gathering platform. So we've asked participants on there if they're happy to share their information, which most of them have, and you have things. Some activities are visible to others, so they can engage with each other. It's like a social networking platform almost, which is quite nice. But we've also made sure to do that offline component as well, because we also recognize that there's a lot of people that might not have digital access for a range of different reasons. So our offline component, where we work with the peer researchers, is actually much more kind of co-produced, because they help us a lot in saying, you know, what works talking to people, what doesn't work talking to people. So we've made a lot of adjustments working with them. So we kind of have those different methods that we're using to kind of get that breadth of viewpoints and perspectives.
Michaela?
Yeah, so we've gone for the low tech, low cost option. So we've been gathering data using Microsoft Forms, which it works, it's effective, it has its downsides. You when it comes to analysis and kind of especially being able to link up participant responses over time, that was hugely time consuming. But yeah, it is a kind of low cost option for doing this sort of work.
So thanks to all the presenters for those reflections on how they've been collecting the data. And now I'd like to turn to Kathy for some discussion of what might we do with it all? I mean, what might all of this mean for policy?
Thanks. I can assure you that in 5 minutes I will definitely not do justice to the breadth of what we've seen, or indeed the richness that lies underneath it when you follow through what's already coming out and what's to come. So this is just by, from a policy, what would you say to policymakers, and what's my gut reaction to listening to all of this? So the first one, this is going to be meta, but the beauty of capturing realities through diary is so important, not just to understanding people on the terms that they determine, but I think what's also happening here is a bit of historical documentation of a period which would be incredibly difficult to document for future generations to understand what it felt like without this kind of method. But it just brings home to me that public policy is expressed in completely different terms these days. So it is all about linear outcomes. Are people's outcomes improving or worsening as a sort of a simplistic linear? And what we can hear through the things that we've shared today is that you can have a good day, a bad day, followed by another bad day, and then a brilliant day, and you can have good times and bad times mixed up all at once. And that is actually the nature of life. This is not just the nature of COVID, but our policy systems and our sense of what makes for good policy, what makes for bad policy, what should be our priorities, are all using metrics and concepts that don't reflect that nature of life, that don't respect the nuance of being happy about some things while worried about other things at the same time. Or the fact that today could be a brilliant day, and tomorrow, if my child is having a bad day, everyone's having a bad day, right? So I'm struck by that, and it's the obsession with linear outcomes is something that we wrestle with at Children England. But I'm struck by it particularly in how you would take the richness of this learning and fit it into an outcome obsessed public policy realm. Secondly, people who know me already will not be surprised by this, but I've been thinking Maslow all the way through. The universality of what this has brought home to everyone. We all have the same basic needs, and lots of people are experiencing a real challenge to them, or a real reawakening of the significance of them, who would not in our current discourse be categorized as people in need, because we pathologize need. Whereas what I'm hearing from these diaries is, I didn't realize how much I needed the friends that I meet at the play school playground, or the getting out of the house, or just that human presence and contact. So home, absolutely. And I have a suspicion that any of these diary projects are probably necessarily missing some of the people for whom home is not safe, not private, and not a place where diary habits can be conducted. So if home, the sense of safety and security, of income, of relationships, if you're not enjoying love and a sense of belonging, if you're worried about your health, if you don't have a sense of purpose, if your child doesn't have that occupation that enables things to run, without those, everything falls apart. And once you're locked down at home, what else is there? So I think it both brings focus to the fact that we are universally in need and one of the things we're in need of is each other. And that policy has tended to ignore the fact that everyone has needs. They've pathologized the idea that, you know, there's too much need for the NHS to meet. There's too much need for the council to deal with, but actually a lot of the answer to meeting each other's needs, it lies with us. And as soon as we're kept withheld from being able to help each other and be there for each other and meeting each other's needs, then we really feel it. That's similar to that. I'm struck by, you know, the simple fact that everyone with a child in their family knows, which is that whether they're doing okay, what's happening with them, who's supervising them, what they're doing, whether they're getting food, whether they're happy, is all consuming. It has the power to completely derail anything else that you're meant to be doing in a day, and that's the nature of childhood, and it's the nature of childcare. So in that private family context, the child is huge. It's a huge person with a huge amount of power, and in public policy they're invisible. They're kind of sidelined as not dying from the disease, so not the kind of the COVID story. People who need to be got back to school so that their parents can work, but not necessarily kind of, my God, the public policy doesn't mirror human behaviour in being completely consumed by the welfare of a child, and if it's not, if you're worried about them, that being all consuming too. And I was also struck by the reflections on how much of life is not lived. Domestic life does not live at home. Like, this is a village, it takes a village to raise a child. The places and the chances to go out, community life that people were missing once they couldn't have it, is just proof that we've got a very simplistic binary dialogue about family life, which is that children belong to their parents, and it happens at home. And then there's the world of work and the economy. But actually what everyone was talking about there was missing being out, seeing people, being in shared spaces, engaging with different services that they might engage with, or community projects. So life is lived collectively, and parents have always needed a lot more than just themselves to look after their children, but maybe this has made it more visible. So I think that underpins the fact that you know, the economy ground to a halt when everyone had to look after their own children, and everyone, I think, appreciated the other things that they and the other people they were able to rely on usually in bringing up their children. If that's true, then we don't get this economy back on track if we don't start looking after our children and taking seriously the networks of the services and support that it takes to do that. So it means we need a child-centered recovery to come back out of a period in which children have rightly and inevitably been the center of households and home life. So those are my kind of headline thoughts. But there's lots that I missed from other presentations as well. But I would just want to say it's one of the richest examples of research work that I've been part of hearing. So I hope all of them continue and kind of continue to enrich our picture.
Kathy, thank you so much for those reflections on the diversity and richness of lives lived. The importance of recognising that some people won't be in a safe enough space to participate in research and projects such as these, and of the importance and richness of sort of wider networks, the impact that children have on people's lives, and the importance of wider networks to them and to all of us. We have just a few minutes left for questions. If you have some, please do pop them in the box. But we've got one from Aideen Young, directed to Eve in the first instance, but if some other people have reflections, they can come onto that later. And you mentioned, Eve, that one of the research questions is, what does community mean to you? And whether or not you have any sort of insights on that, sort of great connections to the points Kathy was making about wider network.
Absolutely. Yeah, so one of the things that we're finding in this study, and I think this also piggybacks really well off of another large piece of work that we do within the Institute of Community Studies, is understanding that notion of community. What is community? How does that change? What's important to people? We're finding it exists in a lot of different ways. So people can experience it as part of a place, as part of a shared identity, a cultural experience. And what's really interesting is during COVID, we've seen some communities remain the same, but we've also seen some communities change, and some people find new communities, especially with the use of digital now. So where people might have had a community where they go to, and like an actual physical space is really important for them, they might now they might experience that sense of community, but in a different way. We've also had people that have talked about fractures in their communities based on different views, different guidelines, the following of different guidelines and this sort of thing. So I can't give you one answer, but I can say that it is complicated, it's changing, and I think there's a lot to learn, especially as the situation continues to move forward, and kind of what community is, how is that influenced by this, and what that means for the future.
Does anyone else have any reflections on community? Okay, I will ask Ruth and Maddie to reflect on, oh, my list of questions has slipped. It has disappeared, but it was from memory, how do you sort of navigate the differences between that private information and particularly sort of the group conversations? So you mentioned how individuals can indicate whether the information they provide is just for you or to be shared with the wider public, but particularly when you're having those sort of discussions amongst a sort of wider group of people, how do you navigate that sensitively?
Yeah, I think it has disappeared because I had replied in writing. But yeah, anyway, we told young people that they are free to share what they want with the group, or like they can just email us privately with anything that is confidential. And of course, in the report, everything is confidential, and on the website, only what they want to make public is posted. But in general, we've seen that these regular discussions are exactly useful to build this report, which speaks to what Madi was saying, that it takes time because the most important thing in participatory methods is to develop this relationship. So we've seen that after a few months, and since the groups are so small, because it's just with 10 people, they've got to know each other better, and they feel more comfortable in sharing even more confidential issues. But still, we give the opportunity of one-to-one for everything that doesn't need to be shared, because the idea is that discussion is just one component, but it's not the entire project. So there is no problem in keeping the two things separated.
If we come in as well, if that's all right. So I think on for us, I guess what's is that they're really quite distinct spaces. So people are sharing through diaries and through kind of responses to the big questions of the week. That's on a kind of individual basis. And then when they come together in the big ideas groups or discussion groups, that's a different space, and the kind of the terms of engagement are really different. And actually, at the beginning of those, we've had discussions that are again on their participatory discussions about what should the kind of I guess, we talk about it loosely as ground rules be. So how are people interacting, and participants themselves talked about it's really important we create like a respectful space. We treat this as confidential space, but actually as well, those discussions are about policy recommendations. So the big, because we want the participants themselves to be involved in working with us to develop policy recommendations about what needs to change and why, which audiences we target and how. So actually, that kind of means that, there is some sharing of kind of confidential experiences, but it's actually moving it on to, what are the key findings that are emerging, and how do we communicate these to policymakers, and that naturally changes the space. I don't know if Maddie, you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, just to add that they're kind of quite action focused, like even if it's not policy, you might be doing an activity collectively. But there has been kind of comments about wanting smaller spaces. So where there has been those comments, we responded to them and kind of reduced the size of groups.
Right, so we've reached the end of our time, and I'm really, really sorry that we haven't managed to engage with all of the questions that were posted. I mean, there were some particularly important questions there about which groups of people might be excluded from diary collecting, how you might engage marginalised groups. And I'm just so sorry not to have had the time to respond to that one, unless anyone wants to do a quick 30-second response to that.
I mean, I would just like really quickly say that on questions as well, we'll, as a team of presenters, we can look at them all and maybe provide some responses that we can write up as a blog, because I think that's an important question, you know, to do justice. But just also to say that I think when we developed this project, at first we were like, oh, diaries, like really? And actually we did like a pilot, because it felt a bit like that, like a bit staid, maybe a bit obvious. And then we did a pilot activity with participants and worked with them where we were like, let's do some online stuff, but let's also do some diaries. And people spoke about really enjoying the opportunity to keep diaries and to be part of that process. So it was led by that, and actually, you know, definitely in terms of, you know, people who are experiencing very real and significant hardship, but still wanting to keep diaries. It's been really important and valuable, both in terms of the richness, which, you know, Kathy touched on in her response, but also in terms of people reporting enjoying being part of that process. So.
Thank you very much for that conclusion there. And I would like to finish by thanking all of you presenters, Michaela, Eve, Maddie, Ruth, Sarah, to our respondent, Kathy, but with the final word, with the thanks to all of those participants in the diary projects. Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.